Welcome to Wildcat.
Is this Wildcat?
This is Wildcat.
Good,
This
good,
is
yes.
Wildcat.
I thought it was.
John and I, and actually Randy, had talked about doing this for a long, long time, which was to get together and talk about our beloved Brett. Each of us, of course, have different stories. So tonight we're going to sit around and just discuss what we remember of him, what we loved of him, and what was things that we saw in his life that were important. We all have different views. So that's the idea of this tape, and hopefully you will enjoy it.
And it's at the perfect hour,
Yeah.
because it's just about snake bite
Time.
That's right, that's right.
And you notice we have our fortification here for the snakes.
Yes.
Anyway.
Cheers to Brett.
To Brett. So who'd like to lead off with the first story?
Yeah, he should go first.
No, no.
That's like the basic.
Okay, I was going to wonder about that. I am Kim Weston, and I was thinking about this today about how I remembered my uncle, and the first time I remembered him. And of course, growing up in our family, it was like Uncle Brett was just like this sort of crazy character that ran around in his sex boots and his leather jacket and his dark sunglasses. And I was going back, and I was sort of peeling back the memories that I had. And the first real memory that I had of him was when we would used to get in the car with my dad and drive out to the east side of the Sierras, 395. And Brett was obviously in some four-wheel drive, some kind of vehicle.
Camera car.
Yeah, camera car. And Dad had this Falcon. And my brother Ivor and I slept in the back, and Dad was in the front. But I remember camping, and there was this fire built, this monstrous fire. And it was always started by some large inflammatory, thing like gas. And I must have been no more than 12. And my Uncle Brett, with his leather jacket and his dark sunglasses, this is in the middle of the night, running around, chasing me and pushing me into the bushes, which were, they were like tumbleweed bushes. And just laughing, and this sort of very funny gay guy just pushing me, little kid that I was, and laughing about it. That's my first sort of coherent memory of Brett.
Well, I'm John Sexton, and I met Brett in 1974 as the crow flies, just a few hundred yards from here, at his home here in the Carmel Highlands. Another photographer, John Woods, and I were coming up to show some prints to Ansel, who also lived just less than a mile from here. And we had done this in the past, and we both wanted to meet Brett Weston. So we were living in Southern California, and I lost the coin toss that we had to see who was going to dial Brett. And when I called, there was a big booming hello, and I explained that we were photography students, and we were coming up to visit Ansel and some other photographers from Southern California, and we wondered if we could come by to meet him and show him some prints. And he explained that he was very busy and that he could only spare 20 minutes of his time. He'd be happy to show us his prints, but he had no interest in seeing our prints. So we arrived around 4-ish, as that was described, and at about a half an hour or so, Woods and I looked at one another. We knew we'd gone over the time, and Brett was showing prints. We said, "Mr. Weston, you said you only had 20 minutes. And he says, "Oh, I've got time. Don't you have prints you want to show me?" And yes, we do. "Oh, you said you didn't want to see them." He said, "I didn't think I'd like you guys. You're from Southern California." And so we actually ended up camping in the driveway and spent 3 days rather than just the 20 minutes. And what impressed me was the new work that Brett had, along with well-known images that he showed us, some just days old. That evening we camped in his driveway, and he said, "I get up 2, 3 in the morning and work every day. If you guys want to come in the dark room, don't ask questions, you can just sit on the floor and watch. We didn't have an alarm clock
That
with
was
us.
amazing.
Oh, it was in the winter. It was cold. Brett, as you know, both of you wore this heavy army
Right.
jacket. It was freezing in there. We just sat with our butts on the concrete. And Brett always said he wasn't a teacher. Well, he didn't think he consciously taught, but he was a great teacher because he taught by example. And to watch him in the darkroom printing Mendenhall
Yeah.
Glacier, it was, he said that day he had decided to do these student prints. And so a print of his that I own, I watched him make,
Right.
and then we watched him mount it the next day. It was amazing to see, even in that first brief glimpse, his dedication and his passion for photography.
Yeah, that was so evident so early. You know, when I finally got to work with him many years later. You know, after just being a kid, I remember going out there and he goes, well, you know, because I've been working with my dad and working on the EW collection and all that, and he said, well, Bob, can you work with 16 by 20 prints? And I said, yeah, I can do it all. You know, and of course he had this sort of idea, you know, well, you know, you're just an assistant. You know? But it's, you know, of course he did all the developing, I mean, all the exposures and the developer, and then he let the prints go to me. And yeah, I've been doing it since I was 12. So I had a rhythm about me, and at the end of the day, he goes, and which to me was a huge compliment. He goes, you do that really well, Bob. You know, and now he ended up, you know, working with him for a long time.
When was your first encounter, Randy?
I'm Randy Efros. Had worked with Cole, Kim's father, quite a bit, and I'd never met Brett, and I really wasn't familiar with his work very much. I was more interested in color and the Edward Weston kind of translating that into color. But I had a show in Scottsdale, a 4-person show that included Diane Nielsen, who was one of Brett's assistants, and she'd moved to Tucson. So Brett was having a couple shows, one here, I believe, and one up in San Francisco. And Diane and my wife and I drove up, we had a motorhome, drove up and we saw the shows, but part of that was that we went to Brett's house, and that's when I first met him with Diane Nielsen, which was really nice, and he was really congenial and everything, but I still didn't have a real flavor for it. But once Kim started working with Brett, then we'd see him more, and then it became sort of an immediate liking. At the time, my family was in the insurance business, and from the start, Brett would look at me and say, why are you doing that? You know, I mean, he didn't really even know me, but he had this way of instilling values and realizing, you know, like in your case, somebody that was serious about it. And if he could see that in you, he would spend the time with you.
Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely.
if he could see there was some drive and whatever. But the thing I got from Brett, most of all, was discipline. You're talking about like getting up, working every day. I spent most of 3 years with him, a lot of the time in Hawaii, and that's what every day was, to get up, print, you know, go out, photograph, develop at night, print, this whole cycle of whatever, with a genuine love of a guy that, you know, was a mature thing, but just loved to do it. And that discipline, that, you know, keeping doing it was just incredible.
Yeah, I never worked directly as an assistant or on a regular day-to-day basis. It was, you know, visits over time and then eventually moving up here. And I think I saw Brett less, actually, after I moved up here and went to work as Ansel's assistant. It was more of a social gatherings. But in the times that I did see him, the simplicity, the austerity of life, the way he had boiled things down, to paraphrase Brett, having 2 main interests, photography and women, and then a 3rd interest, cars. I mean, those were the 3 things, and that's what occupied his time. And I saw where some people who didn't understand the passion for photography thought that Brett was aloof, or he didn't care, but if he sensed that you were serious and passionate about photography, there were few people as generous as Brett in so many ways.
Yeah, that's the one thing. I mean, you're so right on it. I mean, people that met him had this sort of feeling that he was this stand back, he would arrive at an opening, 10 minutes early. He would leave after 5 minutes being there, and he thought, everyone thought that was sort of a judgment, and he really wasn't a judgmental person. I mean, he to me, the most genuine sort of loving person that you could meet. If there was something that he could do for you, he would do it. I mean, be it a camera that he gave you. I mean, I'm a classic example because my work was so different than his, and just like feels apart. He was such a classic photographer. I mean, that's what he did. There was no story. There was no social commentary. There was nothing. It was and that's what I loved about him is that crisp, wonderful look at life. And my work, and especially even Randy's. I mean, the two of us were so different. Randy shot in color. I did black and white, and I did stories. I did themes, and it didn't matter. It's like Randy was saying, and you, as long as you were passionate about what you were doing. And I think he really understood his uniqueness as a person. And like you said, he didn't try and influence other people because I think he saw himself as, and he should have. I mean, he was the most, like Randy was saying, and you experienced was this dedicated. I mean, it's not how I could live my life, but when I first, was dating Gina, and I took Gina out there, and I was working with Brett, and I wanted her to meet him, and so we went out, snake bite time, and showed up, and he was so, I mean, there's another thing I love about him, he was so genuine about women. I mean, Gina was very beautiful, and so it wasn't this sort of bizarre, sort of lecherous thing. He respected her and loved her, and we sat down, we had our snake bite remedies, and we had a couple cocktails, and he was just generally engaged in her and in me at that time. And so as we drove away, Gina goes, "Okay, did he just move there?" And I said, "No, he's been there for 10 years, but the house was so austere. I mean, there was nothing out of place. I mean, there was no knickknacks. There was just his work, his Eames chair, and I mean, it was so plain and so void of any distraction.
It was the ultimate in simplicity, and I wonder if some of that respect for other people's photography and encouraging people in a tacit way. I mean, he would champion you, but that he doesn't mean he's there pushing you to do anything. Right. He's just setting up an environment where you're around or out photographing that he would do his thing, you would do your thing, and seldom would tripods legs cross. Right. But I wonder if part of that might have had its origin with his life as a young photographer within the relationship of your grandfather, Edward. I
think so. I think it was directly related to, and when he talked about his father, it was such a warm, passionate sort of relationship that they had together. It was not a competition. I mean, Brett was always famous about talking to me, and he knew I was growing up, as a third generation Weston, that there would always be that sort of stigma. And he said, Bob, the only competition is you and your work, and rightly so, and he had to deal with that with his father, of course my dad didn't deal with that thing as well. Dad had different sort of ways of dealing with this sort of notoriety of his father. But Brett, I mean, just had this sort of, and Randy knows this, and whenever we talked about Edward, it was this loving sort of wonderful, sort of two guys out there photographing.
Right. Well, I think Edward demonstrated from stories that I heard Brett recount, and in the day books as well, he had a great respect for Brett as a photographer. He was his son, obviously, but he was also an individual, and he respected that. And I think that some outsiders often didn't. They wanted to.
Yeah, they wanted to mix it
Yeah,
up.
and that, I never got the sense that that was the case.
No, I think that I've always felt they had two completely different eyes. And, you know, Brett was very responsive to just seeing something. Edward was more thoughtful, more about something, more reading into his photographs. And Brett was just responsive to light and form and in all situations. And I think there's a real difference between the two. But I know, you know, from working with Brett, he did like to work with somebody. He didn't want people hanging on him.
Right.
But the fact that you were out working was not a bad thing.
Exactly.
And the reason I got to work with him is we had the same working pace. You know, I didn't slow him down. And that's the only thing he wouldn't suffer anybody that was a slow,
Right.
working, deliberate thing.
Well, that was the great line he always said. It was, we're driving by, you know, even when he was in his 80s, he was driving his car because he always insisted that he drove. And he would go, "Bob, is your eye twitching?" And I go, "Oh God, I hope it's twitching." He says, "If you're not a photographer." But yeah, that sort of, that incredible sort of excitement about being together and out there photographing.
Yeah, he just had to do it. And I can remember in Hawaii we'd go out every day, and you don't feel like it every day, and you're covering some of the same territory. And invariably, if we didn't find anything after a while, one of us would just say, "Can I just stop?" And you get out at the power station, or the dumbest thing you ever saw, and in 5 minutes you're both working.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's so exciting to work.
Right.
And if you just got out, you did it. And that's something I learned from him. But he was very responsive to his eye. It was a great tour guide
Yeah.
in that way, because he could really notice stuff.
Well, you spent a lot more time with him in the field than I ever did, but one of the greatest lessons that I learned in my limited experience, and I'm not sure Brett ever knew it was a lesson, is he had moved out to Carmel Valley, and he said, "Let's go to Lobo's and photograph." So we got into his VW at that time, camera car.
Right.
Yeah, the Vanagon. So we're going down off the hill from his house, and we haven't even reached Carmel Valley Road, and it's trash day. And along the side of the road, on the right-hand side, somebody's got a pile of black trash bags. And we're going down the hill. I'm not sure the tires skidded, but we came to a quick stop. He throws it into reverse. We back up. He doesn't say a word. He just gets out, grabs the camera out of the back. It was the Rolleiflex SL66. And he sets up on this trash bag.
Yeah.
And then, you know, when he was done, I asked him if I could look through the pentaprism, and it was this beautiful abstraction.
Yeah.
And as a young photographer, as a student of photography, that was such a lesson to me, because I thought we were going to Point Lobos in
Right.
photographs. And once you got to Point Lobos, then you turned on the switch.
Right.
But with Brett, and I think you experienced the same thing,
Absolutely.
the switch was always on.
Yeah, it was the idea that you were going somewhere, you were heading somewhere, but that didn't mean you were going to photograph.
That didn't distract
That's
you
right,
from,
that's right.
yeah.
I mean, it was the idea of photography. So you had a place to go, but that didn't mean that the work wasn't going to be done one way or the other.
Right.
And that's what I found over the years with most people. They don't feel they can work till they get somewhere. And, you know, you're right, it's a great lesson to be able to work with somebody that
The
can
work
just find
is
stuff.
between the journey. I mean, the journey is at the end, but actually the real good work is in the middle part of that.
Yeah, and I think that was the best picture he made of the day. You know, it was beautiful at Point Lobos. We went to, of course, Weston Beach. And, you know, another lesson that I experienced when John Woods and I, that very next day after we met him in 1974, he said, let's go out and photograph, and we went to Weston Beach. That day he had his Reese tripod with the RB67, and I had a view camera that I'd recently purchased. John had his 4x5 But quite frankly, we were so mesmerized
Right.
by him that
Right,
we
right.
were watching him.
Right.
Because we'd never really been out photographing with a well-known photographer. We'd attended Ansel's workshop,
Right.
and there were, Ansel was an instructor, and there were other great photographers,
Right.
but it was different. It was just Brett and
Right.
the two of us.
Out there it was.
Yes, and so he makes a picture that actually ends up in Voyage of the Eye. But here was the thing that was such a lesson to me, and I always share this on workshops, and it's always a good reminder. He's got the camera real close on a rock, and he's racked out the RB67, and he's doing it very close up, and he's making pictures. Of course, no light meter. He had the ultimate
Right.
Weston
Right,
meter,
right.
built in. And then he picks up the camera, puts it on his shoulder, gets just a few steps away, and starts swearing like a sailor. And I mean, I heard cuss words I'd never heard before. He just realized he forgot to compensate for that lens extension. He went back, set it up again, and corrected and gave the exposure. He processed the film, I think it was the next afternoon, not the next morning. And those other ones were too thin.
Yeah,
And boy, I'll tell you, it was such a revelation to see this photography icon, this godlike person make a mistake. Make a mistake. And I thought, this is a guy that does photography every day. This is a guy that has done photography as an integral part of his life for decades. And you always have to have that switch on. And making mistakes is okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
You're going to make mistakes.
Yeah, you cannot be perfect, and he definitely was not perfect. I mean, you look at his negatives, or you spend enough time with him, like both Randy and I did in the darkroom. But there was a simplicity and a ease of his work. It was, the time I got to spend time with him, that was so ingrained in his actual physical working with prints. When we worked on the big project that he did, the last portfolio, which were 20 by 24 prints, and Randy was involved in this, and the printing part of it, was huge. I mean, he was in his 80s.
Not
And-
much shape.
Yeah, and it was like, to watch him, and still, as his assistant, he would never let me touch the exposure, never let me do anything in the developing tray. But he would take 5 of those 20 by 24 prints and throw them into the developer. And I looked at him aghast. I said, "What do you..." I didn't say anything. 5 20 by 24 prints in a big tray, and he sits there. He had such a wonderful tactile thing with his hands that he worked the prints and made them all develop, more or less in the way they should. I mean, it was like, and me as a young artist, I was looking at him going, I do one at a time, But he had that sense of knowing his craft, knowing what he had to do, and getting beyond just the technical part of it. It was a freedom that he had, and to watch him, like you said, in the field and in the darkroom was magical.